You might have seen one of these before. It's what a lot of Afghan women wear. This was a gift from one of the families that I stayed with during my PhD research in Afghanistan. I'm not here to enter into a debate about the burqa. I just need it to demonstrate in the short time we have together what the war on terror has taught me. So who am I? Well, in relation to the war on terror, someone who can claim to have spent more time than anyone from the West with the class of money men accused of channeling funds for Al-Qaeda, the funds that made 9/11 possible. Random? Yeah, that's what my parents think. 10 years ago, I ran for my life in a burqa. It was from a house in Jalalabad, eastern Afghanistan. I'd been hiding from a rioting mob, seeking revenge on Westerners because of a Newsweek story alleging that the Quran had been desecrated by being flushed down a toilet thousands of miles away in Guantanamo Bay. Earlier in the day, I had escaped narrowly over the back wall of a building that was being ambushed, looted and burnt. I'd lost my headscarf somewhere on the way between being shot at and scaling the wall. Unfortunately, my situation remained hostile because of the growing number of young men that was congregating in the house to debate my ransom value. So I knew I had to get out. But it wasn't until hours later that I managed to communicate through a child with some local friends who smuggled a burqa to me. With this as my new outlook, I then escaped the compound, ran through the riot and reached one of my friend's cars, and from there we took a terrifying journey to the airport. I ran across the tarmac and begged my way onto the last remaining Afghan military helicopter about to depart. And the irony is that I'd only gone to Jalalabad for a change of scene from what was a pretty stressful period in Kabul. Instead, I experienced gripping fear. But I also had the opportunity to see the world through a very different lens. And what suddenly was brought home to me as a non-Muslim wearing the burqa is how everyone sees life through the filter of their own very personal set of experiences. Of course, these are what make each of us uniquely special individuals, but on the flip side, they can also act as a kind of cage or a set of bars that limit our view of the world and cause us to be blinded to other people's perspectives. And because we're all captive to some degree, it's extremely difficult to see things through somebody else's filtration system. And this is especially the case when fear, rather than hope, is the dominant emotion in a situation. And 9/11 was not only the most shocking of attacks, but it generated a culture of fear that was only deepened by what evolved into the War of 1,000 Cuts, anticipated and named by Osama bin Laden himself. This is fragmented, low-level warfare where Al-Qaeda fights on multiple fronts, and its affiliates, wannabes, and those who are inspired by their cause create their own violent attacks. So recent events in Sydney and Paris are chilling reminders of this. Now, in such environments, we readily demonise the things we don't understand, and yet understanding is what we need most. The war on terror has taught me that two key drivers for change will be the way the West goes about building trust and how it discerns who to listen to and when to intervene in a world that is not all black, not all white, and not even 50 shades of grey. Both require nuanced understanding. I'm going to use a few examples now from Terrorism finance to show you what I mean. In 2001, President Bush quickly linked the attacks on American soil to an ancient money system, demonising it and connecting it inextricably to Islam. Militarily, the strategy in Iraq and Afghanistan was to get rid of it. It was referred to by an Arabic name, hawala, simply meaning transfer, but sounding very alien to Western ears. Essentially, it's a self-regulated system made up of networks of money dealers across the world who facilitate real-time international and domestic payments through some pretty complex accounting, and who deliver funds to some of the remotest parts of the world where banks don't have a presence. Now, you might be wondering what on earth inspired me to go to Afghanistan and find out more about this system. Well, part of my inspiration came from this dramatic poster published by the US government's Rewards for Justice campaign. It offered $5 million, and still does, for information that would help dismantle the financial support to terrorists. I wasn't there for any rewards in Afghanistan. I was simply there to understand how this blood money was flowing and whether it really was blood money. I took great pains to avoid recording people's names and taking pictures so that I could build the trust that seemed so important to gaining the access and therefore understanding of this very alien world. And I also wanted to reduce the chances of getting killed. You can probably imagine that looking into a delicate subject like terrorism finance in war-torn Afghanistan presents as challenges, especially for a single white female with no formal affiliation other than to a bunch of professors at a faraway university. And from the locals' perspective, initial perceptions of me were that I must be a spy or a journalist or a business person, or most dreaded of all, a tax collector looking for incriminating evidence. The money dealers clearly thought that my impression of them was that they must be a bunch of terrorists, so many actually offered tongue-in-cheek confessions of being one at the start of an interview, which was a great icebreaker but also a little unnerving at times. So the turning point with the issue of their stereotyping of me and the perception that I might present some kind of threat to them was when I narrowly escaped Jalalabad. But we don't always have the benefit of such dramatic events to shift the way we think. Instead, it takes an enormous amount of effort, which we often can't afford with our limited time. So our tendency is to retreat to our cage and keep things as black and white. As a result of lacking nuance, we risk making poor judgments. And some difficult and sometimes awkward realities also get in the way. So if I take the example again of terrorism finance, we have issues with how we regulate money flows. Of course, intrinsically, money is neither good nor bad, black nor white. We just label it as such according to its source and its use. But herein lies the problem. Every dollar in the pipeline looks the same. And the same applies to a lot of commodities, like jewellery and gold, particularly that traded in the souks of the Middle East. Politics also presents a problem. Terrorism finance investigations have the habit of revealing politically uncomfortable truths about the nature and the depth of the global jihadist movement. The listing and delisting of individuals and entities designated by the US State Department as terrorists is an interesting one to watch. Yet another problem is in how NATO countries have really struggled to build trust in the counterinsurgency and stabilisation campaigns of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's extremely difficult to get money dealers on side when at the same time you're smashing down their doors, making arrests, and seizing their records, which you don't even necessarily understand. Lastly, good information is at a premium. So with all the armchair critics and commentators out there, where do we even start in separating the wheat from the chaff? Who really understands the income sources of the different jihadist groups and how money is raised, moved, and stored? Is it the media? Or perhaps the companies whose products are being traded on the black market of groups like Islamic State or ISIS, ranked as today's best funded terrorist organisation? So what would you need to know if you were the UN in Afghanistan, faced with the decision about whether to use the Hawala system? Well, here's 4 points to consider. 1, customer base. Its customers ranged from, yes, militants, traffickers and corrupt politicians, but also to legal traders, families and aid organisations. 2, achievements. It's achieved some incredible things that have actually gone relatively unnoticed to most of us, like implementing an entire currency changeover within 2 months of 2002, involving 800 million new notes weighing 500 tonnes and filling several plane loads. 3, secrets. The business practices of hawala dealers remain secret to most people, and so it's exceptionally difficult to access their accounts. 4, trust. Its high, if not impeccable, consumer rating stands in stark comparison to the record lows of Western public trust in highly regulated banks. So with this new information as the UN in Afghanistan, what would you do if you were faced with the responsibility of administering $3 billion worth of salary payments to the Afghan National Police since 2003, but the challenge of not having an immediate or even near-term method for delivering those funds other than using the hawala system? Well, the decision was made not to use it. Instead, the UN experienced technical issues in moving the money, and as a consequence, local policemen across the country have gone without pay in some places for up to 5 years at any one time. Like any security force anywhere in the world, no pay has a direct negative correlation with the motivation to protect civilians, and in this case, also the interests of NATO. If there was more time, I'd like to pose similar questions about NATO's poppy strategy, which was also to get rid of it. This has cost Western taxpayers $8 billion since 2002 and produced these results. Cultivation is at an all-time high and supplies the Taliban with double the amount of income than in 2005, when a feasibility study was presented on legalising the crop for the production of the world's most important painkillers, like morphine. The point is that authentic engagement with key influencers within the local business community on both of these challenges was an inconceivable prospect when looking through a black and white filter. Decision makers in the West could only see the locally accepted method for moving money and the source of income from opium as bad. So again, when we fear things, we demonise what we don't understand, fall into stereotyping, and risk making poor judgments. Looking back to 2001, it wasn't obvious at the time, but international and American banks handled much of the money that allowed 9/11 to happen. This is in addition to chains of fundraisers and recruiters of volunteer jihadists who acted as cash couriers and still do today. So what's the wisdom? Well, the Bush administration's immediate fighting response to do what it takes, whatever the cost, is completely understandable. The problem is, bin Laden was much more strategic, and he predicted that the US would be baited and provoked to fight unwinnable wars in foreign lands. In 2004, he clarified in a video released on the eve of the US presidential elections that the plan behind 9/11 was for the US to bleed until bankruptcy. And the message was directed to the American people, whom he warned would be the ultimate losers. And he's right. We've been bleeding billions while the blood money still finds a way to flow. A part of the reason for this is that we've been chasing hawala dealers down the alleys of Afghanistan rather than tracking the fundraisers in the Gulf states and negotiating head-on with those governments and businesses able to influence the situation. There is some good news. Key actors are showing signs of becoming more strategic about the funding of terrorism. We are waking up and we are beginning to see things differently, particularly in the area of law enforcement. Looking ahead, the focus should be on how to build mutual trust and discern who to listen to. From my experience, I know that trust can be built, and the process can be relatively quick. However, it can also be destroyed in mere seconds. So the first step is unveiling your preconceptions by putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, but importantly, not losing your own unique perspective in the process. This means not going completely native. I'd like to suggest that one way to achieve this is by standing beside that person and sharing between you what each of you sees. This would build a much richer picture than if you were to sit on your own and work out answers to exceptionally difficult problems like how to stop acts of terrorism. Now, when it comes to the economy, policymakers must be more discerning when considering who we should be standing beside. And one thing to think about is that we've had almost everyone but business people and theologians involved in what is in large part a financial and theological challenge in the war on terror. To break the vicious circle of playing catch-up with the protagonists, we must improve our ability to anticipate their next moves, which in turn requires us in some cases to reconcile the way we see things with the way they see them. Decision makers will then be much better placed to discern when to intervene and when to step back. Now, as for the rest of us, whatever we're looking at, whether it be terrorism, an epidemic, poverty, your mother-in-law, race or religion, we must think about what kind of filter we're using, and then think about what kind of agenda that sets for the decisions that we make, whether subconsciously or deliberately. Thanks for walking in my shoes for a while. I hope that I've encouraged you to keep challenging the way you and others view the war on terror.